You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your of a split mind host, Abraham.
And I'm your not sure if I'm a hypothesis host, Shane.
Wow, we are a psychology podcast. We talk about all the psychology things. And this one, I think, deeply embedded in the idea of psychology, although not necessarily rooted in traditions of psychology, if you will. But that's what we do.
Yeah, and I genuinely am walking in this episode blind. I have no idea what we're about to do, so...
It should be really fun then.
Yeah.
If you end up liking what you hear today, you can support us by picking up some merch, joining us on Patreon, liking, subscribing, rating, reviewing this episode, share it with a friend, or buy a vanity plate that says WWD, WWD on it. Or if you can fit podcast in there too somehow, that'd be even better.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with all those.
Yeah. I'll talk more at the end of this episode about how you can support us. But first, I would like to recognize that this episode is coming out on March 8th. Of the year of our Lord 2023, and March 8th have some very specific celebrations. What are we celebrating today, Shane?
So I think one of the most important things ever is celebrating International Women's Day. So thank you all for being who you are. We appreciate you, and hopefully the world gets better for you.
Absolutely. It is also Proofreading Day for those of you out editing and editing or something of that nature. Just proofread your stuff for the first time this year.
Yeah.
First and only.
Maybe on that day. Maybe that's like all your manuscripts. You just review that day.
There you go.
It's also National Peanut Clusters Day, which, as peanut butter fans here, anything peanut related, we're in.
Yeah, peanut and butter and peanut butter.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is a hard one to say, but I generally support this. I like this topic. So it is World Maths Day. So in many other places, they like to make soft sounds go together like maths.
Yeah, maths. Ugh. Don't like that. You said that earlier, and I immediately got upset.
Shane just... You don't get to see off mic the upsetness that is Shane sometimes.
Yeah, I'm sitting back just grumbling, going like I'm like Joe Pesci from Home Alone. Whenever I hear
the G-rated swearing.
The G-rated swearing, yeah. It's also No More Week, which is, based on my understanding, is bringing awareness to ending domestic abuse and domestic violence.
Right. Yeah. The first time I read it, I was like, No More Week. Was that maybe this is the advocacy group abolishing calendars or something, but no, It is actually much more important and more serious than that.
Yes.
End domestic violence. All of this is a little bit related to the fact that it is National Women's History Month. So something to be aware of, I think, related. Now, obviously, domestic violence does not just happen to women. It can happen to anybody, men and children and all sorts of people in there, so important to be aware, but it is also Women's History Month, so there's that.
Right, if it's the context.
Yes. Also, and finally, it is Endometriosis Awareness Week, so go be aware of endometriosis, perhaps while eating peanut clusters and proofreading a math manuscript about Women's Day.
Yes.
And domestic violence somehow.
Yes, somehow. Hopefully it's a resolution to domestic violence.
There you go. That's how we celebrate, anyway.
Using math.
Using math. Perfect. If anyone can do it, math can.
Yeah, maths. Not just maths.
That's right, maths can. We are actually talking not about any of those things, but about a person who came up with an idea, and an idea that took root in other people's minds and has sort of just been permeating, I guess, percolating, swirling around, sometimes getting into the conversation, into the zeitgeist, and other times sort of disappearing because it doesn't do a lot, if you will. But this is something called the bicameral mind.
Sounds fancy.
It does sound fancy. It starts with one person whose name is Julian Jaynes.
Yes. So Julian Jaynes was born in Massachusetts and lived from 1920 to 1997. This does sound like a real Massachusetts idea, by the way. What I've learned is that I'm just a wrestling heel, like I'm a wrestling villain. So like every episode, I'm just going to, whatever state comes up, I'm just going to talk trash about it. And then people be like, boo Shane, yay Abraham, and make it that's the fold that we're going to go with from now on.
Oh, okay. So I need to come to the defense of Massachusetts is what I'm hearing here.
Yeah. So
okay.
I just said boo Massachusetts, and you would say
yay Massachusetts.
Yay. Yeah. I guess. So Julian Jaynes, his father was a Unitarian minister, and He registered as a conscientious objector, an individual who claimed the right to refuse or perform military service on the grounds of freedom of thought, conscience, or religion. And I thought that's kind of an interesting thing. So let's dive into that for a second.
Okay. This is still Julian Jaynes, not his father, who Julian Jaynes was a conscientious objector. As a consequence of being a conscientious objector, he was sent to a civilian work camp in New Hampshire. So a lot of times what happened during this period of history is people were drafted. So there was compulsory military service. Mm-hmm. And one way that people who didn't want to fight would try and deal with that is to register as conscientious objectors, saying they are non-violent people.
Yes.
And instead they get assigned then some detail or duty that does not require them to point a gun at other people.
Right. Iggy Pop did the same thing, except Iggy Pop just kind of would just get naked wherever he went. And so that was enough to deem him mentally unfit to be in the military.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So now Julian Jaynes left the work camp citing that these work camps were a nationalistic conscription as part of a totalitarian measure. So, and he was soon arrested and was sentenced to 4 years at the U.S. penitentiary at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. There's lots of burgs in Pennsylvania, by the way.
Indeed.
Boo, Pennsylvania.
Yay, Pennsylvania.
While imprisoned, he worked in the prison hospital and played organ in the chapel. That sounds wholesome and lovely.
Yeah, so kept himself occupied, apparently. Upon his release, he attended Yale, where he received his PhD in psychology in 1946. And so at this point, he would have been 26 years old. He would later refuse to accept this on the grounds of political reasons, citing, quote, much too much emphasis on things like degrees and too little emphasis on intellectual life to which universities should be devoted, end quote. So he had some strong opinions about this and decided to not be Dr. Julian Jaynes, despite having gone through the process to acquire that degree, which fine, I guess.
Yeah, he sounds like he's probably really fun at parties.
Yeah.
So no, he taught at Princeton for over 30 years and taught a wide range of topics in psychology, including the history of psychology, the psychology of consciousness, the psychology of language, and the psychology of perception. He also conducted research on topics such as the relationship between language and thought, the evolution of consciousness, and the nature of mental illness. So you see, this is going to lead to some places.
Yeah.
For somebody who kind of didn't agree with the degree process, at the very least, he was working a valued life by talking about things that he was interested in. He was like actually talking about an intellectual life.
And was able to find a way that he could get paid for essentially just shouting his opinion at people and forcing them to then regurgitate it back to him.
Yeah.
Great. That's the system.
Way to be resourceful.
In summary, then, he is a psychologist. In a sense, he was a researcher. He was definitely a writer, but he was kind of an outsider in the field of consciousness. He wasn't really someone on the sort of cutting edge mainstream of the discussion with respect to consciousness, but he did like to talk about it. Another thing that's going to be important in understanding him that seems unrelated to this, but will become related soon, is that he was also well versed in reading ancient languages, so he could navigate some old text.
I feel like that might be one of those things that would scream red flag. But, we'll get into that later. So we've kind of talked about this idea that he was part of this field of consciousness, the study of consciousness. So we have to kind of ask the question, what is consciousness? Now, before we go too much into it, for this episode, we recommend going to check out episode number 28 from November of 2017. That's how long we've been doing this. We are going to revisit that episode too with more research as part of our nostalgia series, more likely. But it's worth maybe diving into that to get an idea of some definitions around what consciousness is.
Yeah, the sort of some descriptions around the argument people have made either for or against consciousness, what it means, where the research has gone, etc. But I agree. I think that'd be a good nostalgia topic. It is important to understand a bit how Jaynes thought about and interpreted consciousness, though, because that's sort of central to the argument he ended up making. And so, according to Jaynes, consciousness is made up of metaphorical language and is not a biological or evolutionary trait, but a learned process throughout generations. Essentially, I'm just going to say that slightly differently. Jaynes thought that we do not have consciousness now in modern times as a natural biological product of being a human being, but that we have slowly evolved the trait of consciousness over time after we have become human beings.
Yeah. All right.
That's where he's coming from.
Okay, all right. So to quote Jane, he said, "The most fascinating property of language is its capacity to make metaphors." And so the idea of metaphors is going to be something that comes up a little bit here as well.
On the one hand, just speaking off the cuff here, I also think that one of the most fascinating things about language is its capacity to make metaphors. I actually think the most fascinating property of language is its ability to be arbitrary.
Yeah.
And so flexible that it can be anything and affect our behavior through arbitrary modes of communication, and often very subtle ones. So that's, to me, what's the most fascinating property of it.
Yeah.
Metaphors are cool, though.
Metaphors are cool. Yeah. I mean, I think, again, the flexibility in language is really, it makes it one of the most powerful tools, if not the most powerful tool in human history.
Yep.
With also being incredibly flexible and entirely made up.
Yep.
I think of Thor, like all words are made up. Yeah.
All words are made
you're
up.
right. Literally, that's true. Now, he believed that this is how language grew, by continuing to make comparisons to known objects, therefore increasing vocabulary and enhancing language from generation to generation. I would love to know what he thought about Beyonce's Bootylicious getting into the Webster Dictionary.
I think he thought it was good.
Yeah, probably.
So through metaphors, which he considered to be more complex language, we create this metaphorical space, not a physical space, but just sort of, we talk about this idea of space being a platform on which we can communicate something. And so this metaphorical space in which we can describe our mental events. So sort of our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, the way that we try and process information based on metaphors of things that we do behaviorally. And so I'm just going to say that one more time. So through metaphors, we create this metaphorical space that we describe mental events in reference to the things that we actually physically do. There's a interesting thing that Skinner talked about, the idea that we often use metaphors to describe our internal events because we don't have a way of describing them in a way other than our reference out to the world around us. So we might say we have butterflies in our stomach, trying to give the fluttery feeling, or we have a sharp pain. We know what sharpness feels like from an external stimulus. So we might call an internal pain as being sharp, even though we're not actually being stabbed. Or it might be something like a hot pain. And again, it's not actually temperature warm, but we would assign it similar properties because we know what physical external heat does feel like. So we basically use our language to take the things around us and metaphorically describe the things that are happening internally. And I just gave sort of physical pain symptoms, but there's also things going on in our mind, feeling cloudy, for example. I might say that I feel foggy.
Yeah.
I'm using the idea of like, I can't see very well through fog. And if I'm feeling foggy mentally, that means I'm having trouble organizing my thoughts into sort of a coherent, clear picture.
Right.
A clear picture is another metaphor. So anyway, just something.
So many metaphors. Well, and I think, as you kind of start to explore this, it would be really interesting just to kind of see how Jane and Skinner would discuss metaphors, because it sounds like they have some at least agreement on how metaphors might be used to describe certain things.
Yeah.
It's just maybe they have a different perspective on like what that thing is and where it comes from and all that.
And what it means.
Yeah, what it actually means. But, I would be super interested to see that discussion.
Yeah. So anyway, he believed that the process by which we become conscious was not a biological transformation. And this is a very important distinction for him. So this is something we learned, we gained, we have obtained over time, is consciousness. It has not always been with us, according to Jane, which I think does imply in a way that he would argue then that only humans are conscious and that there are no non-human animals that are conscious based on the way that that's described here.
Right. So while you kind of ponder this and maybe expand your consciousness, or maybe just kind of like go through an existential crisis on what any of this means, we're going to take a quick ad break.
Okay, hopefully your consciousness was tuned out during that ad break. We are back to talk about the main topic for today's discussion, which is Jane's big hypothesis called the bicameral mind hypothesis.
It sounds so fancy.
Those words, they roll right off the tongue.
Oh man, words are so fancy.
In 1977, Jaynes released, this is the title of this book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And this book revolved around his original theory or hypothesis of the bicameral mind of our ancestors. So let's break this down, Shane.
Yes. We have to kind of ask the question, what does bicameral translate to? And essentially what it means is two chambers or branches. And specifically when you're using this term politically, two branches of government. Bicameral government will be two branches or two chambers, something to that effect.
Yep. Now, as I've said in the past, we have used ChatGPT to sort of help us, mostly for fun, but in this case, I thought it'd be interesting and potentially useful to ask ChatGPT to interpret Jaynes' theory in less than 100 words. And so this is sort of a synopsis we got back. So I'm quoting ChatGPT here. Jaynes' bicameral mind is a theory that proposes that ancient humans have a divided consciousness, with one half giving commands and the other half obeying. This was based on the idea that language and introspection had not yet developed, and individuals relied on auditory hallucinations from the right hemisphere of the brain to make decisions. As civilization progressed, this bicameral mind evolved into a unified consciousness with the development of language and the ability to introspect. That's the quote. So that's basically it. Like, that essentially summarizes what his bicameral mind hypothesis is. And that's a really great summary, honestly.
Yeah. So my understanding of that, and please correct me if this is off base. My understanding is that originally human beings had this bicameral mind where this thing would happen and then the other part of the brain would obey. But as time went on, this bicameral mind no longer exists.
That's my understanding, yes. Essentially is that we sort of learned and evolved toward a place where we no longer have a bicameral mind, but a unified mind, a socialist mind, if you will.
Yeah. So it's essentially just the pancreas of our consciousness is what this is.
See, metaphors. So good.
That's it. So he believed that bicameral people experienced auditory hallucinations directing their actions. Our left brain was responsible for the doing of our daily activities, while the right brain directed our actions that were novel to our environment, beyond our quote normal daily routine to survive, and that these actions were directed by voices from the gods, rulers, ancestors, or angels, depending on the culture. So I think this important piece, depending on the culture, is super relevant.
Absolutely.
Because if this is supposed to be a biological thing, then that probably wouldn't matter as much. If I guess maybe it's how we label it. I don't know. I think that's fascinating.
Well, I think what he sort of meant is that the different cultures had different gods, but they were all similar in that they all had gods. And I think that's one piece of evidence he used for this idea of the bicameral mind. And essentially, again, just breaking down this idea of consciousness, the bicameral mind was not conscious. It lacked metacognition and introspection, an autobiographical memory, and essentially the ability to know why they did what they did.
Here we are. You said the thing.
I said the thing. And so in Jaynes' words, quote, at one time, human nature was split into two, an executive part called a god and a follower part called a man, end quote.
I thought you were going to say split into dudes.
Split into dudes. Oh, no. Yeah, so we'll keep talking through this, but that's essentially how it breaks down. And I think, just in case we haven't said this clearly, and I think we have, but just in case, is the idea was, as humans were evolving initially, our right hemisphere and our left hemisphere of our brains, according to his hypothesis, were not communicating in the unified way, the way that they seem to be doing now, but instead, the right hemisphere of the brain was sort of our, using Freudian term, ego, and our left side of the brain was our action, is what we were actually doing. And so the right side of our brain sounded to us like the voices of gods. And so we would hear our brain, not our consciousness, because we didn't have that yet. Our brain would basically be telling us what was the right thing to do and directing our behavior. And our left side of the brain was interpreting this as some kind of divine message and then taking action. So that's how the hypothesis shakes out.
Okay. So that might sound like a lot. And we want you to stay with us because, even I'm kind of going, I don't know about that. But just stick with us, hear what we're saying, because I think this is going to get pretty interesting. So another part of this is that Jaynes believed that the ancient texts of civilizations, this is where the ancient language reading and interpretation comes in, that these texts held proof for this theory, since ancient writings depict people being directed by gods to guide their actions. So that was his kind of main argument, is that there was so much direction from the gods, from on high, that would suggest that there was not this idea of consciousness just yet.
Yeah, so according to Jaynes, about 3,000 years ago, we as humans developed into our current conscious state, defining that however you would, but that we've been more or less in this conscious state for the last 3,000-ish years.
Okay. And so he believed that as cultures evolved, like the emergence of agriculture, so on and so forth, more novel problems came into existence. Therefore, more reliance on the gods were needed. So once written communication was used, once we started doing that, we relied less on these voices and more on the written word and started thinking for ourselves. Therefore, language became more complicated, like metaphors. And because of metaphors and because of the advancement of language, we relied less and less and less on outside or those hallucinations that were giving us direction. We actually had it on paper now.
Yeah, exactly right. So Jaynes' theory is, if you're feeling confused, you are not alone. I think there are a lot of people who didn't really understand what he was trying to say or why, and actually even trying to do the research to put this episode together. Big thanks and shout out to our writer Jess, who put in most of the work on this one and did all the major research. It seemed to even be more confusing and not less so the more we learned about it. And we'll do our best, again, to sort of at least unpack what's really going on, and I think offer some critiques that will hopefully help it feel more digestible. But that is not an uncommon reaction to this hypothesis and how it's framed.
Right, yeah. This doesn't lend itself to parsimony very well.
That is something we'll have to discuss here in a moment.
Yeah. So we would like to introduce a quick section of this episode called Mythbusters Jaynes Addiction Edition. So thank you to Jess for that one. That one felt really good.
That was a beautiful subsection title. All right. So as we described, Jaynes got all of his hypotheses based on ancient writings and texts. So essentially his datum, his unit of observation, his proof, is the interpretation of ancient texts that used, and the text specifically used religion and gods to explain phenomenon that they otherwise could not explain, or they wanted to explain in the way that they did using gods. So, for instance, before we knew what an eclipse was, we might think that gods were blacking out our light source. And that might be because they were displeased with how a particular ruler was behaving, or how some civilization had chosen to handle something, or that they had expanded out into new territory, what have you. But whatever it was, it meant that the gods were displeased. And so they were blocking out the sun as a punishment. Now, today we know why an eclipse happens. Through science and observation and all that, we have debunked and replaced the God hypothesis about why eclipses happen. And it's not to blame our ancestors for lacking intelligence to understand this. The truth is only that we were capable of understanding through our current technological advances and scientific knowledge, and probably what Jaynes would describe as sort of our metacognition, our ability to self-critique and examine our own biases as we make these observations.
Absolutely. So his hypothesis, you could argue, is based on confirmation bias. He took the ancient texts he read very literally and made it kind of fit into his hypothesis.
Yeah.
So basically, he had this hypothesis and he took these ancient texts and said, hey, look, see, here's proof of the thing that I already thought.
Yes. All that means is, if all the evidence is simply the texts that existed from the time that survived, that we still have, a Library of Alexandria has been burned down multiple times, and so much knowledge of the world's knowledge with it.
That poor librarian.
Yeah, I have to start all over.
It had to have been so frustrating.
Right. Anyway, all that means is that there's no real empirical evidence for this. We have essentially, he was extrapolating from some surviving texts to come to this conclusion. The bicameral mind is based on his interpretation of that ancient literature, rather than any specific scientific evidence or observations about those cultures or anything they did. So basically, the bicameral mind is his interpretation of the texts he read. Like mentioned before, he could read ancient text, but we couldn't find anywhere that we had anybody else who was coming to similar conclusions based on that text. It seemed like this was all him.
Right. I do have to say, I'm currently reading a book about how the ancient pyramids were power plants. Thanks to Patrick, who helps with notes on the show, because I lost a bet and he's making me read this conspiracy theory book. And I'm a man of my word, so I'm following through on that. And it's just one of those things where you have somebody who is going, here's my evidence of this. Don't really follow what the current consensus is, or I guess maybe like what the experts say. And he says this in this book multiple times. The experts say this, but we don't need to follow the experts. The guy says that multiple times.
Okay.
And Jane isn't necessarily explicitly saying that, but what the vibe I get and kind of the understanding I get so far is that Jane is somebody who is going, well, these institutions might say this, but an intellectual life will lead you to start questioning different ways and different things. And so here's kind of a thing that he started questioning outside of what was generally accepted.
That is very generous of you, I think.
That's my interpretation, being kind.
I think it's great. It's good to be charitable to try and understand this. So this hypothesis of Jaynes that he's come up with, it really emphasizes the idea that there is auditory hallucinations taking place in all of human decision making. I suppose you could consider that it might be people who had some kind of mental illness or something of that nature, who were suffering from some cognitive disorder in a way. This hypothesis specifically then downplays other factors that might have contributed to the texts written in the way that they were, such as social, cultural, and other environmental and circumstantial factors that may have influenced that writing. It really just says the only explanation or the best explanation for why they were writing about gods is because they were having auditory hallucinations, because their minds were split, literally, physically, they were divided, and that the two hemispheres of their brain could not cohesively work together to create cognition.
I guess if you think of the idea of like thinking and talking to yourself without somebody observing it, I could see how somebody could interpret that as not auditory hallucination, but it's not, because it's a thing that's actually like, it's an actual stimulus that you can identify. And I don't know. I could see how somebody could take that argument and turn that into something strange.
Yeah. Again, being charitable, I think you're right. You could.
I'm trying to be so nice to this guy. I don't know why. I have no idea who this. I have no idea why. I have no idea. All right. So essentially, one of the things that comes down to with this theory is that we simply cannot assume that ancient humans were not self-aware, which is a claim that is difficult to prove or disprove. I think it's unfair to assume that humans who were able to build societies, build tools, do these things were generally unconscious or just not self-aware, and that they were being guided by two halves of the same brain.
The hypothesis then assumes that all ancient societies had a similar consciousness or lack thereof. And there's no evidence really for that. The only evidence that's taken is just the texts that have survived and interpreting them in a specific way by one person. Like there's no other thing to suggest that was the case. We have no reason to believe that they couldn't engage in other like metacognition, if you will, self-reference, self-editing, autobiographical narrative style understanding of who they were.
Well, and I think even further, when you kind of zoom out, and this is me talking off the cuff, like you are assuming a large kind of collective experience across an entire species based on partial data.
Yeah.
And even then, it's a almost like a misinterpretation of those data, right? Like, so like, for example, like if we mentioned it multiple times, these are based on texts that he interpreted that are surviving texts. This is not even the entire picture.
Yeah.
Right. So this is not the entire picture of the human experience. So, and it's assuming that these smaller pictures, these smaller portions, these puzzle pieces tell the entire story. And that's just an unfair assumption.
It also, I think, is important to understand who is literate, who had access to materials to record text, who was writing the text, who were their teachers, who was their audience. You know, I think considering, again, just completely ignoring all those other very important factors about who are the people who were actually doing the writing here, who are they writing for, what was writing done for, what was the medium of writing, because before we had written language and texts and that, we basically had, as far as we know, people were probably passing on oral traditions of information,
right?
Which meant that there is some amount of having to store, remember, and communicate those stories and ideas, metaphors, and lessons and whatnot. And people were evolving technology and culture up through times before we had the ability to consistently record our ideas in any meaningful way.
Right.
And because he sort of suggests that as we developed better language and writing, that's when our consciousness seems to have evolved. people were writing before that, or like he's using the writing that people were doing as evidence that writing led to consciousness by showing that their writing was a lack of consciousness, or had a lack of consciousness driving it. And that to me is like, it does not make a whole lot of sense, right?
It doesn't make any sense, but for listeners at home, Abraham, when he said that, he immediately reached up to scratch his head, literally going, this doesn't make any sense, and was scratching his head, which I thought was like the perfect metaphor for like how confusing this is.
I am a monkey. I need a moment to gather my thoughts, engage in some metacognition while some ads play. We've been talking sort of about the critiques of Jaynes' theory of the bicameral mind. Honestly, if we look back, the theory is contradicted by archaeological and anthropological data that suggests ancient humans actually did have fairly complex social and cultural practices, including language and things that seem to indicate introspection and sort of self-referential behavior as well. So I think that we not only don't have any evidence to really support this hypothesis, we seem to have some evidence that directly contradicts it.
And to go further, his writings were very, very, very dense, much like B.F. Skinner's were. However, the difference is that a lot of B.F. Skinner's work was also based on experiments that he was conducting with actual observable datum. It feels like kind of when you look at Jaynes' work, he said a lot of words just to say a lot of words and wrote in a very circular fashion. And people criticize his work as being too dense and lacking clarity. And one of those things might be circular reasoning and kind of coming back to, well, how do you prove that bicameral mind exists? Because of the writings. Well, how do the writings come about if they weren't conscious? Because of the bicameral mind. Like you kind of see that kind of circular reasoning happening in his justifications.
There's a lot to sort of criticize inside of the scientific merit of this, which we're going to get into here in just a moment. But there's a couple of things I found in doing some supporting research on this topic and what people were citing as potential evidence in support of this idea. And I'm going to just read through their ideas and then just tear them apart. And so one of them is this idea that in schizophrenia, with people who have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, there is one source I found that suggested that they seem to process language in both hemispheres of their brain, both the left and the right, in some capacity more so than you might find in someone who does not have that diagnosis. I did not verify that. That contradicts information I had previously going into this episode, so I'm not sure that that person was citing their sources correctly. The other idea is that if you were to electrically stimulate someone's brain today, that they would report hearing auditory hallucinations, specifically the right hemisphere of their brain, that they might report hearing auditory hallucinations such as voices or shouting or something that sounds sort of like language, and that is remnants of the bicameral mind lingering in our brains. Now, I think if you were to apply electrical stimulation to our temporal lobes on either side of our brain, you probably have a somewhat similar thing, because those are the parts of our brains that process auditory information anyway.
Right.
So probably if you were stimulating a part of our brain that processes auditory information, it's going to interpret that in some way as auditory information coming in. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then the other thing that they sort of said is that it gives the credit to all of human civilization and development then goes to the idea of gods, as sort of how this was described. Because in his hypothesis, everything that humans did, they did because gods were telling them to do this. And there weren't actual gods. I mean, there were literal gods in the sense that it was their minds telling them to do this, but they were not actual gods, as in they were these incorporeal beings, but they were instead the right hemisphere of our brain communicating with the left hemisphere of our brain. So to them, It seemed real. It seemed like the voices of real gods, because they couldn't interpret their own brain's workings as their own behavior. It's his whole hypothesis. But it was because of those gods that people were able to build pyramids and build society and advance technology and led to writing and other like advances in sophistication of language communication. That to me is giving a whole lot of credit to the gods, who I think were really in history a byproduct at best in the development alongside our technology and institutions, and often and very demonstrably the case, a barrier to continued progress in many of those same institutions.
Right. Anyway, I guess the more I'm thinking about it, I'm just kind of like, this doesn't account for things like folks that would have been considered atheists at the time who didn't believe in higher powers. Like, this doesn't account for any of those folks either. So, like, that would assume that, like, if everybody was being directed by the gods, then what about the people who didn't believe it or didn't hear that? Or, like, how are they directed? And I just don't understand. I guess the thing that I keep coming back to is it sounds like this guy probably was really into philosophy.
Right. Yeah, I think so.
And it sounds like he tried so hard to put a scientific bent on philosophy through the study of psychology, which was, at the time that he was studying it, less than understood.
Yeah, I think so. He was writing in the mid part of the 20th century, right?
Right.
And at that point, there were a lot of people who were doing awesome philosophical work on psychology. I'm not sure how aware of them he really was. Maybe very, I don't know. But he seemed to be really stuck inside this one possible mode of thinking and interpretation, and was just really trying to dig up as much support for that hypothesis as he could by looking everywhere except where it mattered.
So I think with that being said, though, it's probably worth remembering that psychology is a science, and we should probably revisit some of the basics of science. First being what a hypothesis is. So a hypothesis or hypotheses are an element of scientific inquiry. Upon observing some phenomenon, we may generate a statement about that phenomenon that we can then test to see if we understand that phenomenon better as a result. So the purpose of a hypothesis is then to use observations to guide the development of scientific experimentation of some sort, even if it just means that we're observing that phenomenon in a different way. So ideally, a hypothesis is a question that requires observation, experimentation, replication, all of the things that go along with that.
Yeah. So, for example, we might observe that it appears that that some human, some student, some kid learns more efficiently if they practice a new skill in small chunks every day. If we make that observation, we can then form a hypothesis about the idea that maybe that's the most efficient way to practice that we know of so far. And we can test that hypothesis by designing an experiment in which we arrange practice opportunities to occur more frequently and spaced out opportunities for one. And we can test other different learning modalities for another, or do this a whole bunch of across different groups of people. However, we're going to just test those, and we're going to look for what is the most efficient way that someone learns. And then we use our direct observation from that hypothesis to learn something about what we understand and our observations, and then move forward with new information that we have tested.
Right. So another thing that we could think about here is, like, maybe we observe a star far away and notice that its light specifically dims at predictable intervals. So if the dimming of the star's light is caused by a planet orbiting it, then we should be able to predict the interval and how dim the star is, and thus determine the duration and range of the orbit in relative size of the planet and its distance to the star it orbits. That's actually how planets are discovered.
Yeah.
Is them crossing paths with stars. Or at least that's how it was for a very long time, which is incredible that we've discovered as many planets as we've had using that.
Yeah, it's one of the methods. We look at several, but that is one of the big ones. But you have to also understand, this is not an astronomy podcast, but you do have to understand that means that if we're looking at a star where a planet was orbiting it in a circular path that looks like a flat circle around the star, we would not be able to tell that from the star dimming, because the planet would never cross in front of it.
Right.
So honestly, if we look at it in any other angle except perfectly perpendicular, we wouldn't be able to see the star passing in front of it. But those are all testable hypotheses. That's the whole point, is that these are observations we can make. We can make predictions about subsequent observations and then test to see if our hypotheses bear fruit, if they make sense, if they work out.
Yes, absolutely. Also, just as a real quick note, that observation method for planets does not give us the opportunity to observe rogue planets. Horrifying phenomenon if you didn't know about that.
Fact. Now, that's all talking about what a hypothesis is. So let's be charitable and assume that maybe what he was doing was more of a theory. How is a theory different, and what is that?
So a theory is a general statement made after collecting large amounts of data, testing hypotheses, and developing a strong understanding about a subject. A theory essentially states what we know about a subject in a clear, concise way. So then when you have somebody who is wearing a red hat that tells you they have a theory about what's going on with vaccines or the government, you have to kind of go back and say, is it a theory, or is it an opinion that you found on a YouTube video?
Yeah, it's not even a hypothesis.
Yeah, not even close.
But you could structure them in that hierarchy. I think you're initially and early on in an understanding of something, you're formulating hypotheses. Once you've done a lot of research, you have a lot of data and a lot of information, you're at the point where you can summarize the findings of those experiments into something called a theory. So a theory can often create an opportunity to generate even more testable hypotheses, but it can also be used to develop scientific laws and mathematical models. But a theory takes an enormous body of understanding that we have and distills that down into a piece of information that we can say, this is our understanding about this particular topic. Our theory of evolution is we've made these hundreds of millions of observations or whatever, however many there have been, maybe billions at this point, all these observations that show how life changes over time in response to pressures from the environment. And all of that together looks like we're going to describe that as being evolution, and that evolution is this change over time that represents pressures, natural selection, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. That allows us to then summarize all the information we have into one concise statement. So that's what a theory is.
Right. So why are we even talking about this? And it's because Jaynes' bicameral mind doesn't reach the rigor that it would take to call us a theory. We kind of ask the question of where does it fall here? As far as its purpose and direction in relation to science, is it a theory? Is it a hypothesis? What is the point? I mean, we're not doing an existential crisis here where we're asking what the point of anything is, but we are asking what the point of kind of discussing this is, because my argument would be, based on everything that we've talked about, it's a hypothesis at its weakest level. It's charitable to call it a hypothesis because its data are not sufficient to even support the question. I mean, this is I feel like it's an easily disproved question with other data.
Yeah, it's definitely not a theory. It's not summarizing a lot of available data. And I think you said it right. Calling it a hypothesis is kind of generous because it's not even based on a lot of observation. The observation it is based on is historical text, but it's actually based on interpretation of those historical texts through a lens that seems to be pretty biased in one single direction.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, all of this has been dramatically offending one group of people, and to find out who that group of people is, come back after this break. Okay, so we've been essentially trying to describe as charitably and as accurately as we can what Julian Jaynes' bicameral mind is. And if you are listening to that and thinking, I'm on board, this gives me purpose in life, I want to learn everything I can about the bicameral mind and Julian Jaynes' theory, well, you're in luck, because there is a Julian Jaynes Society that you can join of like-minded individuals who are also dedicated to furthering this idea.
Also, Jaynes was one of the founders of the International Society for the History of the Behavioral Sciences. So at least there's that.
Yeah, that is a thing. When a graduate student in the psychology department of a university was asked what they thought of Julian Jaynes, and they said, a well-regarded kook, I think that does sum him up fairly well.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Jaynes' hypothesis has sparked interest in hearing voices and inspired the Hearing Voices Network. On their website, their tagline states, quote, "For people who hear voices, see visions, or have other unusual perceptions," end quote. So there is also that in the world.
Yes. One distinction that Jaynes made was, behaviorally speaking, is that consciousness is not necessarily needed for learning to take place. And there's the example of classical conditioning, where we're often unaware of the type of learning that's taking place, even when it is happening. That is actually true of other deliberate learning as well. You don't necessarily notice you're getting better at something until you've gotten a lot better at it.
Right. So, I mean, at least, it sounds like he was, I don't want to say he subscribed to those ideas, but at least he acknowledged them.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. I'll give him that somewhere. Now, Jaynes believed that people with schizophrenia have reverted back to a bicameral mind. So, if you want to, you can try to get your treatment covered by telling that specific thing to your insurance company. Also, I would like to point out that untreated schizophrenia could be a little bit challenging. And I would imagine that an entire society of people who have essentially a bicameral mind, which is likened to schizophrenia, might be really tough to manage.
That is a fair point. Yeah, that would be really tough. It doesn't seem like it would get very organized. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not giving enough credit to our friends with schizophrenia.
To be fair, I was going to say, just because people live with schizophrenia does not mean they can't be functional or Now, there are varying degrees and spectrums, obviously, but the argument that he's making that schizophrenia is just reverting back to bicameral mind is I feel like, probably not a good example of, probably doesn't make his theory really sound or his hypothesis really sound.
No, it seems to weaken it, actually.
Yeah.
And in addition to other things. In the book, The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, he refers to Jaynes' book stating, quote, "It is one of those books that is either complete rubbish or a work of consummate genius, nothing in between. Probably the former, but I'm hedging my bets," end quote.
Interesting.
Yeah, so acknowledges that. Fun fact, Jess met Richard Dawkins and got him to sign her copy of The God Delusion, so that's fun.
Yeah, that's fun.
I've never met Richard Dawkins.
Neither have I.
Okay, well, I think that's mostly what we have to say about this. I do really want to summarize this for our take-home points, because I think I want to make sure that we've described his theory as clearly as possible. Jaynes' hypothesis essentially stated, I think I said theory there, just assume I said hypothesis, or replace it in your mind, if you will.
Yeah.
Jaynes' hypothesis is that a long, long time ago, people did not think the way that we think today. Everything that they did and said, and all of their works and organization, was based on the idea that the right half, the separate right half of their brain, was telling the left half of their brain what to do, and that they interpreted that as the gods, some god or angel or some ethereal figure, was commanding their behavior, and they just obeyed. They just did whatever it said. That's essentially what it boiled down to, and that over time, our minds eventually merged into one unified conscious entity. And his evidence for this is how often in historical texts and across cultures, they reference gods and angels and other ethereal figures as being catalyst figures for things that they did and things that took place. That's essentially what his hypothesis boils down to, is that idea.
Right. So it is super interesting to think about. It's a fun thought experiment to kind of work through and all that, but there's just not scientific evidence. That's what it ultimately boils down to, is it's really fun to assume certain things or think about certain things or kind of play with different ideas and use language and metaphors to describe those things and work through those things. However, this particular theory, the idea of the bicameral mind, simply doesn't have anything to support it. It is a single source of data from a single interpreter, and there has not really been much beyond that to make this any sort of reasonable or viable.
The other thing I'd like to say for myself, and how I approach this and understanding it, is the problem I have with the idea that an even remotely logical interpretation of all historical text is that it is meant to be taken literally, that it is meant to say that they really believed that it was in fact gods who were in fact telling them what to do, and that they were in fact just obeying. That to me seems like a huge stretch, right? Because his whole thing is that, like, we eventually learned to use metaphor, and that's amazing, awesome job, cognition, good way to go.
Sure.
But why not just interpret their use of gods as metaphors? How do we know that they're actually referencing anything that was really meant in fact be a god, and they weren't instead just describing some fantastical name to a real observation of a phenomenon and giving it some, like we call our hurricanes that happen by a name? Are people 1,000 or 3,000 years from now, assuming we still have a planet with people on it at that point, gonna look back at our text and assume that we believe that the hurricanes were actually people or maybe some kind of god? Maybe, but like, is that the error that we're making interpreting the text of people of old? If he assumes that we can look back and understand what they meant and how they felt and what they were thinking at the time that they wrote those texts, using our own language and our own interpretations from thousands of years after those were originally written, that to me is like so far away from the idea of testable hypotheses and pragmatism and rational interpretation that it's like you're making leaps and bounds past anything for which we have any evidence.
To add to that, even if there were evidence to support something like this existing, my question would be, how is this useful?
Yeah, right?
It's one of those things where you go, okay, so this tells me, I mean, to me, when if I think about religious texts or like any sort of ancient text, I think of like, this is a really interesting historical record that people engage in certain behaviors around. But this idea of a bicameral mind does not do anything for I just don't see where, if this were like maybe from an evolutionary biology standpoint, talking about the development of neural networks over time and how neural networks start to evolve and how, like, you know, brain matter and mass and all of those things start to happen. Like, if this were embedded in that somewhere, then I could see where there would be utility, but I don't really see that here. I see this as like a separate thing, like outside of the field of what is the known science around neural development, neurological processes, and I don't understand how this is useful in any sort of way.
You're exactly right. I think ultimately, like, the most damning thing we can say is, what's the point? You know?
Yeah.
I guess just to summarize it for myself, I don't think that this holds any weight. I don't think that it's particularly useful personally. I don't think that it influences in any meaningful way the way that I would interpret things moving forward. Even if we say this is busted, I suppose you could say that diving into this hypothesis at least forces us to explore our own existence, evolution, and consciousness, which is a good thing to do now and then. So sure, it does beg the question of why we think what we think, or why we do what we do, if you will.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jess, for throwing that in there a couple times. But, you know, one thing I guess I was going to say was this also assumes the existence of and legitimacy and utility of the idea of consciousness.
Right.
Which we have discussed in that previous episode and will discuss again in the future, is in addition to the fact that this is a hypothesis, barely a hypothesis, resting on no empirical data that cannot be proved false or true, it is also relying on a concept for which we don't have any clear understanding at all.
Right.
This idea of consciousness.
Right.
So it is a imaginary castle built on clouds. Like, there is nothing holding it up, and it is not even really there.
Yeah. I think we've done it. I think that we've killed the bicameral mind.
Slain.
Myth busted.
Myth busted. Well, that's fun. This is a fun one to discuss. And so let's get into some recommendations.
Recommendations.
So, one of the things I have learned about myself is I am an avid collector of things, but it's always random stuff, and it's hard because, like, for those of you who are watching on the Patreon feeds, you can see the books in my background, and it's very difficult to buy books for somebody who has so many books. And this is something I've heard time and time again in my life. And one of the things I have learned is that in the last few years, I've really come to appreciate gift cards. So I'm going to go ahead and recommend gift cards. Here's why. A lot of times people get real upset about this, and they get real nervous about getting somebody a gift card. They kind of are like, it's so impersonal. It doesn't feel like it's well thought out. The truth is, it's probably very well thought out. You probably spent a lot of time trying to figure out what you were going to get for somebody. You were probably trying to figure out exactly what you get for somebody who you don't know what to get for because they have the things that they'll go buy or purchase something for themselves. So if you are worried about gift cards, I'm going to give you permission. It's okay to get somebody a gift card. They will like gift cards. I love gift cards because that means I can go buy things that I know that I don't have. And so that's something I would recommend to everybody. It's okay to buy gift cards for somebody. Allow yourself to buy gift cards.
I've never been offended by getting a gift card as a gift. And even if it was to a place, I'm like, wow, I've never been there before and have no plan of going there. I'm like, it was thoughtful, and you tried.
Yeah.
And I can now regift this to someone who is going to use it. And that's one less thing I have to do.
Yeah, exactly. So there's really, it's all great. The main thing I would just say is just make sure you use your gift cards.
That's true.
Or repurpose them.
Yeah. They can sit in a drawer for a while. Sometimes you forget that they're there.
Yeah.
And some of them do expire. So keep that in mind.
That's true.
All right. I am recommending something I'm going to give just a small amount of context for. I told Shane about this, I think, last time we recorded, which is that I have been tracking my miles per gallon in my car since 2011. We'll just say that.
Yes.
I've been aggregating that data into an Excel spreadsheet so I could start seeing what my miles per gallon looks like in correlation to things like weather and what kind of gas I was using. I think one of my original ideas was I wanted to do an experiment where I paid for the more expensive gas to see if that affected my miles per gallon. I sort of followed through on that, but not really. Anyway, point being, it has been a really interesting experiment, and I would love to invite people, if they would like to participate in this with me, to start tracking your miles per gallon. I think it's something. If you're in an electric car, this is a pointless activity. Don't bother. But if you're in a car that has to use gasoline, then I would be interested to see what people come up with, where their cars are at, and that sort of thing. And so I'll just tell you really quick the things that I track. So I always write the date, the gas station that I got it. I do the pump number just in case there's something useful about that. I also do the type of gas that I get, how much gas I get. That's actually the most important thing. And mileage at the time that I get that gas. I started just going to my tripometer thing so I could have like the exact miles really quickly without having to do a bunch of subtraction to find, with large numbers since I have a lot of miles on my car. But anyway, so what the most important thing you need is the mileage for that since the last time you filled up and how many gallons you put in your tank. That's the most important thing.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I also track the weather. So I have an idea of like how temperature might be affecting my miles per gallon, probably mostly in how much I'm using my air conditioning or heating, as well as how much I paid for it. I decided I was going to track the cost over time.
Yeah.
And so anyway, if you have those data and you would like to send them to me, I would love to start aggregating data and start looking at people's miles per gallon, or just start tracking it just for yourself, just for fun.
Yeah, just for fun.
I like knowing these things. So anyway, that was an extremely long explanation. I went on over for several minutes, so I'm sorry. But tracking miles, your miles per gallon and gift cards, that's where we're at.
I like it.
Okay, let's wrap up very quickly. If you would like to support us, join us on Patreon. You get all kinds of bonus stuff by doing that. The people who have already joined us on Patreon includes Amanda, Brad, The Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kelly, Kim, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, Shauna, and Stephanie. Thank you all so much for being our supporters. I have a wonderful team of awesome people who help me do the things that I do and help us write this podcast. That includes Justin, Selena, Alan, Jess, Patrick, and Shane. Thank you so much for recording with me today.
Always.
And for being here. And of course, as I said, special shout out to Jess for her work on our notes and support with this episode.
Yes.
If you would like to tell us about the bicameral mind, whether you agree or disagree with our interpretation of that hypothesis or a thing that's kind of a hypothesis, or you would like to send us an awesome compliment, you can reach out to us at info@www.podcast.com. You can also reach us on the social media platforms where you find most people anymore. So that is, I think, all that I have. Am I missing anything, or do you need anything, Shane?
I think that covers it for me.
Perfect. Thank you all for listening. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.